Detective Agatha Marple. The Gilded Masquerade. A Detective Tales. Chapter 1. The grand ballroom of the Belmont estate shimmered with opulence, each crystal chandelier scattering light across the marble floors. A string quartet played a haunting melody that drifted above the murmur of conversation, laughter, and the occasional clink of champagne glasses. Guests moved like a sea of glittering shadows, their faces hidden behind intricately crafted masks. Each mask told its own story, some adorned with feathers, others encrusted with jewels, and all designed to obscure identity and amplify allure. The Gilded Masquerade was not merely a ball, it was an event whispered about in exclusive circles for weeks in advance, an invitation coveted by all who considered themselves members of the city's elite. Victoria Belmont stood at the top of the grand staircase, a vision of decadence in a gown of deep gold, her mask a masterpiece of delicate filigree. She held a champagne flute aloft, the subtle sparkle of diamonds on her wrist, catching the light as she commanded the attention of the room. Victoria had a presence that demanded admiration and scrutiny in equal measure. Her voice, smooth and assured, carried over the orchestra's final notes as the music softened to silence. "Welcome, dear friends," she began, her words weaving through the stillness like silk. "Tonight we gather not merely to celebrate the season, but to honor the essence of mystery and intrigue. For beneath these masks lie secrets, desires, and truths that make us who we are. And yet, as the night unfolds, one must wonder, how many of us are truly honest about the faces we choose to wear?" A ripple of polite laughter followed her words, though a few guests exchanged uneasy glances behind their masks. Victoria's gaze swept the room, lingering on no one for too long yet managing to convey the unsettling impression that she saw more than she should. Lowering her glass, she smiled, though the sharp edge of it was impossible to miss. "So, let us enjoy the evening," she concluded. "But do remember, every secret comes with a cost." The toast ended with applause, but the atmosphere shifted, the room suddenly charged with an undercurrent of tension. The quartet resumed playing, and the guests returned to their mingling, though their laughter now seemed brittle, their movements more deliberate. Detective Agatha Marple, attending the ball under the guise of a distant cousin to one of the lesser-known guests, observed it all from her quiet corner near the grand fireplace. Dressed in an understated emerald gown and a simple mask of green velvet, she blended into the background with the ease of someone well-practiced in the art of discretion. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, the man whose hand trembled as he raised his glass, the whispered exchange between two women near the terrace doors, the servant who paused just a moment too long as he refilled a champagne flute. Agatha had attended such gatherings before, though never in a personal capacity. The glittering facade of wealth and sophistication had long ceased to impress her. She knew all too well that the wealthier the mask, the darker the secret it concealed. It was just as she was considering the cryptic nature of Victoria's toast that the first scream pierced the air. The music halted mid-note, and every head turned toward the source of the commotion. A young woman, one of the servers, stood frozen at the edge of the ballroom, her face pale and her tray of glasses forgotten on the floor. "Miss Belmont," the girl gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the open doors leading to the library. The crowd moved as one, a wave of silken gowns and sharp tuxedos surging toward the doorway. Agatha followed at a measured pace, her mind already racing ahead of her steps. The library, dimly lit by the flicker of a solitary wall sconce, revealed the lifeless form of Victoria Belmont sprawled on the Aubusson carpet. Her golden gown was stained crimson, her mask askew to reveal wide, sightless eyes. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, the guests recoiling in horror and fascination. Agatha stepped closer, her gaze narrowing as she took in the scene. The angle of the body, the absence of a visible weapon, the faint scent of expensive perfume mingling with the metallic tang of blood, each detail lodged itself in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. "Nobody touch anything," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. Heads turned toward her, some with confusion, others with relief. "We must call the authorities at once." The conductor of the ball, a middle-aged man with a neatly trimmed mustache and a frazzled demeanor, stepped forward. "And who, may I ask, are you to issue such orders?" he demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. Agatha fixed him with a calm, piercing stare. "Detective Agatha Marple," she said simply, reaching into her small clutch to produce her identification. "And I'd advise everyone to stay exactly where they are. This masquerade is far from over." The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of her words settled over the crowd. Somewhere in this glittering assembly of masks and secrets, a murderer was hiding, and Agatha Marple intended to unmask them all. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. The library, dimly lit, and now cordoned off by Agatha's firm but measured instructions, had become a somber tableau of death. Victoria Belmont's lifeless form lay still, her golden gown tarnished by the blood that had pooled beneath her. The masquerade's guests, once a swirl of laughter and intrigue, now huddled together in tense clusters, their masks clutched nervously in hand or perched precariously on their heads. Whispers rippled through the room, each voice carrying the same thread of dread. A murderer was among them. Detective Agatha Marple, still in her understated emerald gown and velvet mask, stood at the edge of the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning every movement. Her years of experience had taught her one valuable truth. Guilt had a way of seeping out, no matter how carefully one tried to conceal it. The conductor, his composure fraying with every passing second, stepped forward. I have sent for the police," he stammered, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. Agatha turned to him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Good. But until they arrive, I will conduct a preliminary inquiry. This is not my first encounter with such matters." She adjusted the small notebook she had retrieved from her clutch, flipping it open with practiced precision. Her voice carried across the room, firm and even. "No one is to leave this estate until further notice. Rest assured, the sooner we clarify the events of this evening, the sooner we can all return to our lives." This statement, though intended to reassure, only deepened the tension. Agatha was quick to observe the reactions it provoked. A man in a crimson mask glanced furtively toward the library's far corner, his hand twitching as if to adjust his cufflinks. Nearby, a woman with a sapphire-encrusted mask tightened her grip on her champagne flute, her knuckles whitening as her companion whispered something hurriedly into her ear. Small gestures, perhaps, but they were rarely meaningless. "Let us begin," Agatha said, her voice now softer but no less commanding. She motioned for a nearby steward. "Tell me, who discovered the body?" The young woman who had screamed earlier stepped forward hesitantly, her face pale and her hands trembling. "It was me, ma'am," she said in a shaky voice. I was bringing fresh glasses into the library when I saw." She trailed off, her eyes darting toward the lifeless figure. Agatha placed a steadying hand on the woman's arm. "Take your time," she said gently. "What exactly did you see?" The steward swallowed hard. She was lying there just like that. Her mask was crooked, and there was blood. I dropped the tray and screamed. "Did you notice anything unusual before that? Anyone entering the library, perhaps?" The steward's brow furrowed as she tried to recall. I did hear voices earlier. 2 people, I think, arguing. But I didn't see who they were." "Thank you," Agatha said, releasing her arm. The girl backed away, her relief at being dismissed evident. Agatha's eyes returned to the crowd. "Now then," she announced, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "If anyone heard or saw anything unusual tonight, no matter how insignificant it may seem, I urge you to come forward now." There was a long, uncomfortable silence, broken only by the faint rustling of gowns and the occasional clink of glassware. Then, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "I saw her speaking with Mr. Whitmore," said a tall man in a simple black mask, "just before the toast." They seemed tense. All eyes turned to Charles Whitmore, who stood near the fireplace, his mask now removed to reveal a carefully neutral expression. "I hardly think a tense conversation warrants suspicion," he said smoothly. "Victoria and I often had spirited discussions about business." "Indeed," Agatha said, her tone betraying no emotion. "And what was the nature of this particular discussion?" Whitmore's lips curved into a faint smile. She expressed concerns about an investment I had proposed. Nothing out of the ordinary. Agatha made a note in her book, her gaze lingering on him a moment longer before shifting to another corner of the room. There, a young woman in a sapphire gown stood apart from the rest, her posture rigid and her eyes darting nervously. Agatha had seen her earlier, during the toast, whispering urgently to a man whose mask now hung from his fingers. "And you, miss," Agatha said, addressing the woman directly. "You seemed particularly affected by Mrs. Belmont's toast. Might I ask why?" The woman's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing beneath her mask. I don't know what you mean," she stammered. Agatha took a measured step toward her. "You seemed anxious, almost as if her words held a personal significance." The woman opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by a sudden crash as a tray of glasses toppled from another servant's hands. The distraction was brief, but it was enough for the woman to slip back into the crowd, her retreat hastily masked by the commotion. Agatha made another note. This was not the time to press further, but she'd marked the woman in her mind as someone worth observing. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew almost palpable. The guests, once so assured of their superiority and security, now looked over their shoulders, their carefully curated personas beginning to crack under the weight of suspicion. For Agatha, it was a familiar pattern. The guilty always revealed themselves in time. All it took was the right nudge. Stepping back to the center of the room, Agatha surveyed the uneasy crowd. Somewhere among them was a killer, and with each passing moment she was getting closer to uncovering who it was. Chapter 3. Peeling back the masks. The grand ballroom of the Belmont estate, once alive with music and laughter, now served as an uneasy holding pen for the guests. The glitter of jewels and the gleam of polished shoes did little to disguise the tension thickening the air. Agatha Marple, poised and unassuming, moved quietly among the attendees, her sharp eyes noting every shift of weight, every glance exchanged, every telltale sign of discomfort. She knew that guilt and desperation often hid in plain sight, masked by feigned innocence or bravado. She began her inquiries with Eleanor Winslow, a rival socialite who had long nursed a bitter envy toward Victoria Belmont. Eleanor was a vision of cold elegance in her sapphire gown, her mask now dangling from her fingers as she sipped a fresh glass of champagne. "Mrs. Winslow," Agatha began, her voice calm yet pointed, "I understand you and Mrs. Belmont were well acquainted." Eleanor's lips twitched into a tight smile. "Acquainted, yes. Friends? Not particularly. Victoria and I, we had our differences." "Differences that might have led to animosity?" Agatha asked, her gaze steady. Eleanor's expression hardened. "If you're insinuating I had something to do with this tragedy, you are sorely mistaken. I might not have liked Victoria, but I am hardly capable of such barbarity." Agatha noted the flash of indignation in Eleanor's eyes and the way her hand tightened around her glass. "Of course, Mrs. Winslow," she said mildly. "But tell me, what were you discussing with Mr. Whitmore before the toast?" Eleanor's mask of composure faltered for the briefest moment. "Business matters," she said quickly. "Nothing of consequence." Agatha merely nodded, filing the detail away for later. "Thank you, Mrs. Winslow. That will be all for now." Next, she turned her attention to Charles Whitmore, Victoria's business partner. He stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his polished demeanor giving little away. "Mr. Whitmore," Agatha greeted him, "your name has come up more than once tonight. It seems you and Mrs. Belmont were discussing an investment proposal." Whitmore's smile was thin and practiced. "Victoria and I often had spirited debates about our ventures. She was cautious, perhaps overly so. And did this caution ever lead to disputes?" Agatha pressed. His jaw tightened, and he glanced briefly toward the cluster of guests behind him. "Disputes are common in business, Miss Marple, but nothing that would warrant such drastic conclusions." Agatha's sharp eyes caught the nervous glance he exchanged with a tall man in a crimson mask. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I may have further questions later." As the evening wore on, Agatha's observations brought her to Margaret Belmont, Victoria's estranged cousin. Margaret's hands fidgeted with the hem of her silver gown, her nervous energy a stark contrast to the composed facade of the others. "Miss Belmont," Agatha began gently, "this must be a most difficult evening for you." Margaret looked up sharply, her eyes red-rimmed. "Difficult? It's a nightmare. First my cousin, and now this inquisition." "I'm sorry to trouble you further," Agatha said, her tone soothing. "But I must ask, had you and Victoria spoken recently?" Margaret's eyes darted to the floor. "We had words. About the inheritance, as you've probably heard. But I would never." Her voice broke off, and she shook her head. "She was my family." Agatha studied her for a moment before offering a small nod. "Thank you, Miss Belmont. I'll let you be for now." As she moved through the room, Agatha's keen ears picked up on hushed whispers and furtive glances that hinted at a forbidden romance. Near the terrace doors, a young woman in a blush-pink gown and a man in a crimson mask spoke in low, urgent tones. Their body language spoke volumes. The way she clutched his arm, his hand brushing against hers, both glancing over their shoulders to ensure they were not overheard. Agatha approached them just as the man's voice dropped into an audible growl. "We'll talk later. Just stay calm." "Am I interrupting?" Agatha's voice cut through their bubble of secrecy like a blade. The young woman stepped back, her cheeks flushing. "Oh no, not at all. We were just discussing the tragedy." "Of course," Agatha said smoothly, her gaze flicking between them. "And what might your names be?" The man hesitated, then extended a hand. "Julian Crawford," he said, his tone guarded. "And this is Miss Lydia Harcourt." Lydia's smile was tremulous. "Detective, do you really think the killer is one of us?" "It seems likely," Agatha replied evenly. "Unless, of course, you know something that might suggest otherwise." Lydia's face paled, and Julian placed a protective hand on her arm. "We know nothing," he said quickly. "This whole affair is as shocking to us as it is to everyone else." Agatha didn't press them further, but made a mental note of their interaction. As she turned to leave, a small folded piece of paper slipped from Julian's pocket. He quickly snatched it up, but not before Agatha caught sight of the initials VB, scrawled across it. Her investigation was interrupted by a sudden noise from the far side of the room. A tray of glasses had crashed to the floor, and one of the servers hurriedly bent to clean up the shards. Agatha's sharp eyes caught the look of fear in the server's expression, as well as the hurried glance toward Charles Whitmore, who now looked decidedly pale. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Agatha felt the familiar thrill of the chase. Someone in this room had killed Victoria Belmont, and as the evening wore on, their carefully constructed masks would continue to crack. But just as she was about to question Whitmore further, a folded note was slipped into her hand by an unseen figure. The message was brief but chilling: "Leave this alone or you'll regret it." Agatha's lips curled into a small smile. Whoever the killer was, they were getting nervous. And that, she knew, was the first step toward unmasking them entirely. Chapter 4. Revelations and Red Herrings. The library had become Agatha Marple's base of operations, a quiet sanctuary away from the growing unease in the grand ballroom. The guests lingered in their clusters, their whispers growing louder with every passing minute. Agatha, however, was deep in thought. She sat by Victoria Belmont's imposing oak desk, its polished surface cleared save for a single item, a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp, retrieved from a concealed drawer in the desk. The discovery had been a stroke of fortune, or perhaps, as Agatha preferred to think, the result of careful observation. Victoria, it seemed, had been keeping secrets of her own. Opening the journal, Agatha's sharp eyes scanned the pages, her lips pressing into a thin line. The entries were a curious mix of cryptic notes and detailed accounts of her interactions with various figures at the ball. Names leapt from the page: Charles Whitmore, Eleanor Winslow, Margaret Belmont, Julian Crawford, Lydia Harcourt. Beside each name were brief, damning notations: Whitmore, untrustworthy dealings with offshore accounts. Suspicions confirmed. Winslow, jealousy brewing. Letters intercepted. Margaret, inheritance dispute growing volatile. Crawford and Harcourt, affair concealed, leverage held. The journal painted a picture not of a socialite hosting a glittering party, but of a woman meticulously gathering dirt on those in her circle. Victoria Belmont, it seemed, had been playing a dangerous game of blackmail. Agatha's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. It was Eleanor Winslow, her sapphire gown swishing as she entered the room uninvited. She paused upon seeing the journal in Agatha's hands, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. That belongs to Victoria," Eleanor stammered. "You have no right to go through her things." Agatha set the journal down carefully. "Mrs. Winslow, this journal sheds light on many things, including your own relationship with the late Mrs. Belmont. Care to explain why she referred to you as jealous and mentioned intercepted letters?" Eleanor's face flushed crimson. "That's absurd. I never really—" Agatha interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "You and Victoria shared a contentious history. Perhaps your intercepted letters were not as innocent as you claim." Eleanor's composure cracked. "I had no reason to harm her. Yes, we exchanged words in the past, but I would never resort to murder." Agatha noted the tremor in Eleanor's voice but said nothing. Instead, she rose and closed the journal, leaving the woman to stew in her discomfort. Agatha had no intention of revealing her full hand just yet. Later that evening, the focus of suspicion shifted abruptly to Charles Whitmore. Agatha's questioning revealed a discrepancy in his account of the evening's events. He had claimed to be in the ballroom during Victoria's toast, yet a passing steward swore he had seen Whitmore slipping into the garden moments before the murder. Confronted with the accusation, Whitmore's calm veneer faltered. "I stepped outside for air," he admitted. The crowd was suffocating. "Did you encounter anyone?" Agatha asked. "No, I was alone." The vague response did little to convince Agatha. She pressed further. "And the garden, does it happen to lead to the library's terrace?" Whitmore's face tightened. "Yes, but I never entered the library. You're grasping at straws, detective." The room buzzed with whispers as guests eyed Whitmore with suspicion. Agatha, however, wasn't ready to commit. Whitmore's explanation was thin, but something about his demeanor, the absence of desperation or overcompensation, suggested a red herring. The breakthrough came when Agatha decided to revisit the journal. Among the cryptic notes, she found a peculiar entry about Margaret Belmont, key to everything hidden in plain sight. This puzzled Agatha. Margaret had seemed nothing more than a grieving cousin, racked with guilt over her inheritance dispute. But this note implied something more significant. Agatha sought out Margaret, finding her seated in a corner of the drawing room, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Miss Belmont," Agatha began gently, "I need you to be honest with me. Were you aware of this journal?" Margaret's eyes widened. "Journal? No, I didn't know she kept one." "Victoria seemed to think you were key to everything," Agatha pressed. "What might she have meant by that?" Margaret's hands fidgeted. "I don't know. We argued over the inheritance, but..." She hesitated, then sighed. There was something. She mentioned she had proof that the inheritance wasn't hers to begin with. Agatha leaned forward. "Proof of what exactly?" Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "That the estate it was promised to someone else. A debt she owed." The revelation reframed the entire investigation. Victoria had been living on borrowed time, surrounded by people whose lives she had entangled with her secrets and manipulations. But who among them had the most to gain by silencing her? As Agatha pieced together the threads, she realized she was closer to the truth than ever, but the presence of red herrings meant the road ahead would not be straightforward. And as she returned to the library to review her findings, she found an envelope waiting for her on the desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a chilling message: "You're getting too close. Leave now or face the consequences." Chapter 5. The Masquerade Unmasked. The grand salon of the Belmont estate was a masterpiece of gilded opulence, with its towering marble fireplace, glittering chandeliers, and plush velvet drapes framing the tall windows. Tonight, however, it was no longer a place of grandeur but of reckoning. The air was thick with tension as the suspects, the guests of the fateful masquerade, sat in a semicircle before Detective Agatha Marple, their faces betraying varying degrees of unease. Agatha stood before them, her small frame dwarfed by the room's grandeur, yet she commanded the space with quiet authority. She held a small notebook in her hand, its pages filled with the careful observations and deductions she had made throughout the night. Her voice, calm and deliberate, broke the uneasy silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we are gathered here, not for the revelry you anticipated, but to uncover the truth behind the tragic demise of Victoria Belmont, a woman who, as we now know, was far more complex than she appeared." A murmur rippled through the room, but Agatha raised a hand, silencing it. "I have spent the evening observing, questioning, and piecing together the puzzle of her murder. Now I believe I have the answer. But first let us examine the motives and alibis of those present." She turned to Eleanor Winslow, who sat stiffly, her sapphire gown a stark contrast to the pallor of her face. "Mrs. Winslow, you and Victoria had a contentious relationship. Jealousy over social status, intercepted letters, and bitter exchanges, all of these paint a picture of rivalry. Yet, I believe your disdain for Victoria was not enough to drive you to murder. The letters you claim she intercepted were harmless flirtations, not secrets worth killing for." Eleanor exhaled sharply, relief evident in her eyes. Next, Agatha's gaze fell on Charles Whitmore. He met her eyes with a practiced calm, but a sheen of perspiration betrayed his nerves. "Mr. Whitmore, your business dealings with Victoria were unconventional, to say the least. Offshore accounts and dubious ventures would provide ample motive, especially if she threatened to expose you. However, I find your alibi, though shaky, plausible. You were in the garden at the time of the murder, as corroborated by a passing steward." Whitmore's lips twitched into a faint smile, but Agatha's expression remained impassive. "Your secrets, Mr. Whitmore, are safe for now." Margaret Belmont was next. The grieving cousin sat wringing her hands, her silver gown crumpled from hours of anxious fidgeting. "Miss Belmont," Agatha began, her tone gentler, "your dispute over the inheritance is well known. You argued with Victoria, and she had proof that the estate was not rightfully hers. Yet, despite your anger, I believe your grief is genuine. You may have had motive, but not the resolve to carry out such an act." Margaret let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. Finally, Agatha turned to the pair near the far end of the room, Julian Crawford and Lydia Harcourt. The forbidden romance between the two had been revealed through their furtive glances and whispered exchanges. "Mr. Crawford, Miss Harcourt," Agatha addressed them. "Your relationship was a secret Victoria intended to use to her advantage. Her notes made that abundantly clear. Such leverage could have driven you to desperation, yet I noticed something peculiar." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Miss Harcourt, you were the one who discovered the hidden journal among Victoria's belongings, weren't you? I saw the way your eyes lingered on it when I mentioned it earlier." Lydia's face turned ashen, and Julian's hand tightened over hers. That doesn't mean anything," Lydia stammered. "Perhaps not," Agatha replied, "but it does lead us closer to the truth." Agatha stepped forward, her voice steady and deliberate. "The murderer is someone who had much to lose if Victoria's secrets came to light. Someone who knew precisely when and where to strike. And that someone is—" Her gaze fell not on Lydia or Julian, but on the steward standing by the door, his face pale and his hands trembling. "You," Agatha said, pointing to the young man. "James, the ever-diligent steward, you had access to every corner of this house, and you knew Victoria's movements better than anyone else. But more importantly, you had a personal connection to her secrets." The room erupted into shocked murmurs, but Agatha silenced them with a single raised hand. "Victoria's journal mentions a debt, a promise she broke, one that ruined the life of someone close to you. James, your sister, wasn't she?" James's face crumpled, and he fell to his knees. "She destroyed my family," he sobbed. "She promised to help us, to save us, but she betrayed us. My sister took her own life because of what Victoria did." Agatha's voice softened, though her resolve remained firm. "Revenge is a powerful motivator, James. But murder cannot be excused, no matter the pain behind it." The room fell into stunned silence as two uniformed officers entered, summoned by Agatha earlier. James was led away, his cries of anguish echoing down the halls. As the guests slowly began to disperse, Agatha stood alone by the fireplace, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. The masquerade had been unmasked, and the truth had been laid bare, yet as always she felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction in knowing justice had been served. The glittering masks and silken gowns would return to their wardrobes, and the secrets of the city's elite would fade into whispers. But for Agatha Marple, there was always another mystery waiting, another truth to uncover. Chapter 6: Justice Restored. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Belmont estate, casting golden light across the grand salon. The glittering remnants of the previous night's masquerade, discarded masks, an abandoned champagne flute, and a crumpled invitation lay scattered like forgotten relics of a bygone era. The room, once filled with opulence and intrigue, now seemed heavy with the weight of exposed truths. Detective Agatha Marple stood at the foot of the grand staircase, her emerald gown replaced by her usual practical attire. A simple hat sat perched on her head, and in her hand she carried a modest suitcase. She looked out at the assembled guests, or what remained of them, who milled about the room, their conversations hushed and their faces drawn. Margaret Belmont sat near the fireplace, her silver gown wrinkled, her face pale and weary. Across the room, Eleanor Winslow spoke quietly with Charles Whitmore, their once icy rivalry thawed by the shared ordeal. Julian Crawford and Lydia Harcourt stood by the tall windows, their gazes distant, their forbidden romance no longer a secret. And of course, the staff moved through the space with subdued efficiency, their usual briskness replaced with solemnity. Agatha stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmur. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are free to leave. The investigation is complete, and justice will take its course." A ripple of relief passed through the room, though it was tinged with unease. The revelation that James, the unassuming steward, had been the murderer had shocked them all. Yet, as Agatha had said during the dramatic climax of her deductions, his actions were the product of a deep-seated betrayal, a pain Victoria Belmont had inflicted through her manipulation and broken promises. Margaret approached Agatha hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Detective, I just wanted to say thank you for uncovering the truth." Agatha gave her a small, kind smile. "The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, Miss Belmont. I merely gave it a gentle nudge." Margaret nodded, her lips trembling as she stepped back. Eleanor Winslow was next, her usual hauteur tempered by a newfound humility. "Detective Marple," she said, "I hope you realize that despite everything we are grateful." Agatha's smile remained faint but polite. "Gratitude is unnecessary, Miss Winslow. What is necessary is reflection. Perhaps now, with Victoria's shadow lifted, you may all find a way to move forward." As the guests began to disperse, their carriages and automobiles carrying them away from the estate, Agatha lingered for a moment by the grand doorway. She looked back at the house, at its ornate facade and the secrets it had concealed for so long. The masquerade was over, both literally and figuratively, and the masks these people had worn both at the ball and in their lives had been stripped away. Agatha's mind turned, as it often did, to the nature of human behavior. Deception, she mused, was a universal language. The elite wore their secrets as carefully as their finest jewelry, and yet, when faced with the unrelenting truth, even they could not escape their own humanity. With a quiet sigh, Agatha turned and walked down the steps of the estate, her suitcase in hand. At the gate, a modest taxi awaited her, its engine idling softly. She climbed inside and gave the driver the address of the train station. "Busy night, miss?" the driver asked as he guided the car onto the long, winding road away from the estate. Agatha smiled faintly. "You could say that." The driver chuckled. "Well, here's to a quiet day ahead." Agatha nodded, though her mind was already moving ahead. She had no intention of seeking quiet. Another letter sat in her bag, the faint scent of ink and parchment clinging to it. Another case, another puzzle waiting to be solved. The world, after all, was full of mysteries, and Agatha Marple would never lack for work. As the car disappeared down the road, the Belmont estate faded into the distance, its glittering halls now silent. The guests, scattered to their respective corners of the city, would carry with them the lessons of the night, lessons about greed, betrayal, and the unyielding nature of justice. And as for Agatha Marple, she disappeared as quietly as she had arrived, a quiet, unassuming figure with a brilliant mind, leaving behind a trail of truth in a world so often clouded by deception.